Welcome to Between the Lines, a podcast where three curious minds come together to go beyond the pages of a book. I'm Hari, alongside Tulip and Arvind. We read, we reflect, we challenge, and we share what truly moved us, the ideas that sparked something new, the lessons that made us think differently, and the assumptions we dared to question. Whether you are a lifelong reader or just discovering the joy of books, pull up a chair. Let's explore what lies between the lines.
Talk about a really exciting new book. It was published in late 2025. It's called Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. The author is Dan Wang. He's a Chinese American research and tech analyst who has lived in Canada, US, and China. So he's really well positioned to talk about this topic, a very important topic about the rivalry between the world's two largest economies, China and the United States. Very important for investment, science, technology, lots of fields. He actually worked in Silicon Valley as a tech analyst and then departed to China and lived there from 2017 to 2023, which was some very important years, which span the start of the US China tariff war, which includes technology sanctions on semiconductors. And of course, in 2020, the major COVID pandemic, which started in China and affected the globe. So he was there during some very crucial times in China, understood the culture, economy there, and wrote very extensively about it. And most recently, also about the growing rivalry between the US and China in artificial intelligence. I came across Dan Wang over the past couple of years when he appeared on many financial podcasts, such as Bloomberg's Odd Lots, making some very good observations on the tech scene. So when I heard he came out with his book, I was eager to pick it up, and I'm glad we've discussed it. The book is very detailed on personal anecdotes from his experiences in China. The core thesis of the book, which goes throughout the book and is almost a guideline, is he contrasts China and the United States by describing China as what he calls an engineering state, in contrast to the United States, which he calls a lawyerly society. And this theme is the key theme of the book. And at first glance, of course, it is literally true. For those who are familiar with China, the politicians in China are overwhelmingly engineers. For example, Xi Jinping is a chemical engineer. His predecessor, Hu Jintao, was a hydraulic engineer. Most of the Chinese Politburo for the last 30 to 40 years have been dominated by engineers, especially the ones who build industrial and infrastructure very heavily. In contrast, it's well known that the United States politicians historically and even today tend to be very heavily lawyers. Most of the United States presidents have been lawyers, and this is true of both political parties in the U.S., Republicans and Democrats, even Democrats perhaps even more so, dominated by lawyers. So from a top level perspective, it is technically true that China is very heavily dominated by politicians or engineers and the US by lawyers. But there's much more to it than that. This is more of a cultural and philosophical topic as well, where China prioritizes building execution at massive scale, and whereas the US today prioritizes process, regulation, checks and balances, legal aspects, which tend to, in the current time period, block growth in many ways. And that is his thesis. And it goes deeper in another way, which is that in the case of China, even though we're talking about the engineering state in terms of the physical infrastructure industry that China has become well known for as becoming the industrial center of the world. But he expands the topic of engineering to also talk about social engineering. And that to me was one of the most interesting parts of the book, because he talks about how China not only the government thinks it can fix society and engineer the society, for example, through the one child policy, which is a chapter in the book about engineering the society in a certain direction, and also another chapter about how the very heavy-handed engineering approach towards the COVID lockdowns is another aspect of this. So it's an interesting way where the term engineering is used not just in the technical sense, but also in the mindset of a regime that basically designs a society and everything around it. And so I'll leave it at that theme. There's a lot of richness in the book, and we can discuss specific content items, but I wanted to just lay out that basic theme. And then the rest of the book is mainly case studies talking about this engineering state of China versus the lower state of the United States in different settings and case studies.
Tulip, you're on
Philip, you're
mute.
still on mute.
Thanks, Arvind. That was pretty detailed. Pretty much my first impressions that came out of the book was the idea or behind Wang's central theme, central framework, which is engineers versus lawyers, where China builds and America kind of blocks, is genuinely useful and catchy. In more sense than one, and it's brilliant. About like say 50 pages, then you start noticing that what all he wants to explain, he can't kind of explain it's very he wants to do the heavy lifting, but by the time you come to the end, you start noticing that there is this a little bit narrow or shallowness in the explanation. What did stay with me was the infrastructure sections and the way Wang turns these lens back on America. But because obviously for a book to like just talk about China would be lame, and that mirror that he shows is kind of uncomfortable but valuable in all essence. And then there are even-handedness and was fine in parts, but there were moments when he wanted to just say like, for example, the zero COVID policy, or for example, even the one child policy, where there were moments where I just wanted to, just say the thing rather than being very politically so-called correct. So to summarize, it's worth reading, worth discussing, but it's a sharp essay which is sketched into a book. Basically, what is, as you mentioned, right? It's his thesis essentially in 7-8 chapters that he's mentioned.
Thanks, Arvind, actually, for pointing us to this book. I think, as you mentioned, I think it is at the right time that we need to kind of approach this topic, understand a little more about, like, how the probably the two most powerful nations today in the world, right? In terms of like their economic power and also the way they are competing for the technologies, and especially in the age of AI, right? How both of them try to kind of are racing towards established that supremacy. It is very important to kind of understand their background and the way of thinking, right? Probably which models the overall nation's attitude and response to any particular situation, be it social, political, or otherwise. And it also actually, for somebody who wants to kind of define a public policy, or like who would want to kind of envision like what a nation state should be, like, you can see like what are some of the best principles from both of these nations and then build it. And for us, coming from the Indian background, like you would want to kind of evaluate like how would India fit in any of these schemes, and see like what is India perhaps doing well, or like what is it not doing well, and where should it actually put more energy and focus into. So I was always looking from that lens, like, are there areas where India has done far better, right? And definitely we are not there in terms of like the economic superpower, or like even in terms of the technology advancements that probably China has done, and even which America has probably not been able to kind of scale in few areas, especially in the infrastructure places that he quotes, right? So from all that standpoint of view, I think it was a good eye opener. And as Tulip pointed, yeah, of course, you would wanted the research to be probably a little more deep and bring in more insights. Perhaps like his own limitation was in terms of the exposure that he had, right, for those only 6-7 years. And also not sure like how much closely he was having the access to a lot more like political decision making, or like the other aspects, right? Like probably whatever he was observing was like any other common man, what he is going through, or like what he is reading in probably the some of the journals and the newspapers. But sitting very close to the policy making, or like working very closely with some of the entrepreneurs and other things, that part may be lacking is what I felt.
Yeah, those are really good observations, Hari, and Tulip yours as well. The part of the book, that seemed a bit deeper and a bit more nuanced to me was when he talks about industry. One of the sub concepts that he has in there is this notion of process knowledge, right? Which is, it has become more talked about. But where he's going with that is that in the United States, and I would argue that maybe this is also true of India, where what tends to be valued is the strategy, the idea, the design, and the actual making of things in the United States. And I would argue maybe even in India in the past at least, the making of the actual object gets less emphasis. So India excels in the intellectual areas of software development that's very idea oriented, conceptual. Those things get prized, and that's been the case in the United States as well, of late as well, because if you the example I think even Dan Wang gives of Apple's iPhone is designed in California, made in China, right? So that concept of the idea work, the brain work being done in the U.S. and the making of things being done in China was something that the U.S. was okay with living with because it thought that the major value was in the brain power of coming up with the ideas and design. But what Dan Wang argues, and I think this is turning out to be the case, is that if you don't own the actual making, you gradually lose the expertise. So China, by being the place where the iPhones are made and all of the products are made, gradually they've built up that expertise in manufacturing, creating a vast workforce skilled, and they are able to move up the chain. So they're no longer just the assembly group; they're the ones designing the products. And now, when you get to things like electric vehicles, they're now dominating in terms of the actual design, and someone would argue, right? So they've been able to work up the stack because they've built up the industrial and expertise base of manufacturing and what Wang calls a process knowledge. And that's what the US now is trying to catch back up with, realizing they've missed out. And I would say that, even in India, you hear of make in India, the need to actually make things, both it comes from the standpoint of the huge masses of a country like India being able to get employment rather than just an elite group. So it comes from the right place. Also, if you look at what Dan Wang is saying, it will be good for India to get into manufacturing, to build that process knowledge up as well, so that it can go up the chain once it has that base.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, like since the point of India has come up, yeah, like with the Atmanirbhar Bharat and the mission of 2047 that the Prime Minister and the government has put out is basically to come up with these things where we are the not only the just the end users, but actual designers, actual makers of things that people elsewhere will use. And one of the examples that I can give recently is the maritime history that India has was known for before, like centuries ago, is now picking up speed, and now we are trying to build up our whole infrastructure of top-notch ships. We did one with the INS Kundilia with Sanjeev Sanyal and other. The Navy kind of put up with the 5th century, making of a ship. So there are these nuances of making actual things in India, coming up with top-notch design, equipment, manufacturing, and the whole process knowledge is kind of coming up. And that is where the shift is. And then we can talk about the differences between American cultural, societal thing versus China versus India, and what that can lead to in each of these things. But definitely there is a shift that is being seen, and you can see that is kind of deviating from the so-called Western democracies or Western powers that were there before, and now how it's shifting. But to that point, I think he's put up this China story well as a process or an infrastructure thing, but I feel there was a lack of mention of Singapore, or even for that matter Japan or Korea, which did the same thing with not that much of, say, political difference, or like the communists are being heavy handed. So that's where I feel the kind of nuance kind of just kind of you can say dilutes itself, because these were the same whatever examples he's given of China. Japan did it, Singapore did it with less of political influence, you can say. So definitely that's something that could be discussed more.
And for me, I'm looking at see, each of the nations are trying to solve a problem which is of different nature and different scale, right? Probably the problem that China had to kind of start with about 60 years back, right? And where they were in terms of the population and the economic status and other things. I don't know whether it warranted them to kind of take this kind of an approach, right? Approach perhaps was the only thing that could have helped them to kind of
establish some amount of economic supremacy and also kind of bring in the technology advancements, right? But for us in US, like in the last 60 years, when it was coming out of the World War II, it already had gone into building a lot of scientific and technology supremacy, right? So it had, and it was almost becoming a very wealthy society, and the problems and the challenges that was being represented was probably different, and probably the way they organize themselves is also totally different. And when it comes to India, probably which is comparable in terms of like the population size or with respect to China, and we have seen how we have struggled probably the first 40, 50 years after our independence. I don't think so we made the kind of progress that we would wanted, right? And we took a probably very, very socialistic approach to our society, right? And when you take such a large population, and we know even when you are trying to kind of run an organization, if you make it too democratic, you are strangled for making the decision making, right? Because you are trying to kind of appease larger population, and in that way you may end up making very suboptimal decisions. So for me, with respect to India, I feel that we have done a lot of suboptimal decisions over the last 40, 50 years, and it had retarded that progress. Right now, only in the last 10, 12 years, we are seeing an aggressive push towards the manufacturing sector or like the scientific research aspect of it, right? So, and that is happening because there is a decision making which has that kind of capability to kind of make some large decisions, own it, and execute it, right? And that's where I'm trying to kind of compare. Sometimes it's a healthy mix of these two. I don't know where how to kind of strike that balance. Probably that is where the struggle is, right? And how do you kind of make sure that like you are not too engineering, and at the same time you are not too worried about like the lawmaking and those kind of stuff. So you need to kind of balance both of them. And for India, I think you need to kind of really note what will work for a country of this size. Like again, services will still be a larger part of economy. I mean, as I'm still in right now in India, and I'm observing like to create the employment opportunities and to get everybody to work. It is not only the intellectual kind of work that is needed, but you also need a lot of services, probably like manufacturing. Again, in manufacturing, one needs to evaluate given the kind of the natural resources that we have and like a lot of other constraints that are being put. How do we what kind of manufacturing should India choose? We have not done very well in the electronics manufacturing because it requires huge scale of investments, right? And also other natural resources that can support. If you have to put up a PCB plant, it takes huge amount of natural resources to do that. So those are some of the observations.
Yeah, Hari, those are really good observations. And it points to something Tulip was also saying that it would have been more valuable to also get the case studies from Japan, Korea, Singapore, others, which have had great industrial development alongside a democratic system, so that this kind of heavy-handed approach versus the lawyerly approach, that contrast could be, the nuances could be understood better, so that understand what else can countries do to develop. So that was a missed opportunity in the framing. One of the other aspects that the author doesn't talk about that, but from an investment standpoint, is quite important, is that China's economic growth has been massive and development has been massive compared to the U.S. The economy in China in the last 20 years plus has grown much, much faster than the United States. But ironically, the stock market of the United States and India has grown much more rapidly than China's. And that is an interest, that's a contrast that investors often talk about. The returns to investors in India and US have been much superior to China in the last 10, 15 years. And that is a bit of a paradox because people see the huge improvement in China at the physical level, production level, but then they see the stock market in the US is dominant. The Mag 7 that have big tech companies in the US, even the broader US stock market has vastly surpassed China. And even if you look at India, India has been a very strong performing stock market. And that's, from an investment standpoint, that's an interesting contrast that economic growth alone is not what investors care. Investors do care about property rights, kind of investor protections. Whereas in China, this kind of heavy-handedness towards investors has hurt returns. They did a massive crackdown on technology companies that destroyed a lot of the share prices of the big tech companies like Alibaba and others that is briefly touched on in the book, but not in as much detail as one would expect. And also, what is also interesting is that there is this concept of allocation of capital. If you are an Indian business person or an American, you make business decisions based on what makes business sense, what gets you market, what gives you a good rate of return on your what you're building, right? Which may be, as you're saying, Hari, it may be suboptimal at the government level in some ways, but at least the business people are being rational in how they allocate, and that leads to good rates of return on their business decisions. Whereas in China, for example, because of the government policies of getting towards very rapid growth, that can ironically also hurt returns. For example, electric vehicles, which China is becoming very successful in, the profitability of that industry in China is very low because the government is promoting as many electric vehicle makers as possible. And so there are hundreds of
Yeah.
EV manufacturers in China. All of them are competing, and there's very little profitability. So the investors in those companies will not do great, right? Because you have so too much competition, very low returns. Whereas in the US, you have Tesla, which is an extremely valuable company that has less competition, for example. So that's a nuance that is not touched on the book in that, in a way, the government policies of China are creating this infrastructure and productivity, which is maybe in some ways arguably quite good for the society and development. But from an investor's lens, sometimes you will want them to be more hands-off to allow more rational decisions.
In the same ballpark, the other question that is barely asked is the debt question, and probably Arvind and Hari would be in a better position to answer, because this whole infrastructure boom, right, it's substantially debt financed by these local governments using land sales, state banks, to implicit guarantees for developers, like what Evergrande is one of the developers there. And this sustainability, right, the fiscal sustainability of this engineering state is hardly touched in the whole book, and which is concerning, right? Today all the infrastructure whatever we see is all rosy dory, but there is this whole debt ceiling that kind of will burst somehow or the other. And probably the margin of profitability is one way where we are not seeing that sustainable growth, probably last year, this year, and probably in the coming couple of years too. So is this like a building model of abundance, debt fuel construction, kind of will require this painful reckoning? Not today, but tomorrow. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think, and also he gives examples of cities where they've built numerous
Poverty.
airports and infrastructure, right? And if you look at the utilization factor he talks about, right, like many of them probably are not at all operative, right? Like because it doesn't motivate the businesses to kind of run, flights and sustain them, right? To your point, Tulip, I think definitely that is something that needs to be seriously examined, and that's probably also coming to kind of biting them back, right, in terms of like the aggressive investment that has been debt funded to kind of put in all the infrastructure. At one point of time, probably it created a lot of employment, a lot of economic growth nationally. But today, in order to kind of sustain that infrastructure, and it requires certain amount of uh, business to kind of being used, right? The businesses need to kind of start using the infrastructure. And if like more than 60-70% of them goes unutilized, then there's no way of recouping that investment, right? And I think that's some of the struggles that they are going to face definitely.
Yeah, I think both of the observations are very good in terms of this debt overhang probably was not fully discussed enough as a trade-off, and the overcapacity industry-wise, overinvestment that bodes poorly for the future in some ways, and all that effect is already being seen. The economy growth in China has slowed dramatically. There is a massive real estate downturn for the last 4 or 5 years where housing prices have fallen. And one thing just to link to another aspect of the book that was quite interesting is the one-child policy,
One
right?
chance.
You've had this massive investment in infrastructure and housing and other things, the returns on those types of investments are very dependent on utilization. And then if you couple that with a shrinking population, which means inherently you've locked in reduced demand, right? So the to me that chapter was one of the, even though it's a more historical chapter, going back into the late 70s, early 80s when they instituted the one-child policy, and the effects are dramatic. It was very shocking to read in some ways the how harsh and cruel the Chinese policies were to force abortions on hundreds of millions of families. The estimate that they provide is 320 million abortions were done, many of them forced, and 100 million sterilizations to curtail the population. And the cruelty was quite striking to me, but the effect of it, is interesting to think about, because in the early years when the population growth was curtailed, it led to a lot of economic growth because you had very few dependents, because you had a young population which didn't have too many dependents, didn't have old people or too very young people. So you had a very heavy working adult population that was very productive. It had a massive, what we would now call demographic dividend 30 plus years ago. Working age population boomed, factories had lots of manpower to come in and work, very high productivity growth, huge production. But that is now flipping, right? And that is something now, as because of the one child policy, you now have, instead of a demographic dividend, you have the opposite, where you now have, one working adult supporting two retired parents and maybe four retired grandparents. So there's huge dependency, and that one family here doesn't necessarily have a pool of future workers to support them. So the demographic population pyramid is turning upside down, and the population, it's shocking to think, but in the next 50, 60 years, the population of China will fall in half, right? And that is a shocking thing to think about, that whereas India's population will stabilize, it will not crash. It will, as the population growth reaches replacement level of roughly two children per family, the population will stabilize at 1.5 billion in India, whereas China's population is forecast to fall to 700 million from about 1.5 billion today, which will have a dramatic effect of effectively losing more than half a billion people.
Yeah.
And so that is something that, to me, was an interesting example of excessive social engineering that China did.
Sure.
Now, as I think back to, both, as we all know from India, it's actually interesting nuance. One of the things that the writer doesn't talk as much about is that India actually implemented the family planning policy before China did. But there was a huge backlash in late 70s after the emergency. And so India watered down the policy of the aggressive family planning. There was even forced sterilizations, forced abortions that were happening in India in the late 70s. But then the policy got changed to be milder.
Yeah.
So the population growth of India did not come down as much. Whereas in China, they were much harsher and they stuck to it for 3 decades. And now you see the result where it was a big economic payoff, but then now it's going to become a massive economic drag, almost to the point where it could crush the country.
This is the same aspect that complicates his engineering thesis, right? Where he says, the engineering model with one, and this can be anything, right? In this case, in China's case, it's a one-child policy, but in some other countries' case, it might be something else, where one downturn or one aspect is of societal, cultural, or political interference, and the whole engineering state thesis kind of can fall down or just crumble, and that's where I think more discussion was warranted in this book. But it was like mind-numbing to know the history of the one-child policy, from where it began and what things happened concurrently in like 70, 75, I guess in late 70s. And where it's going to come to bite, as you mentioned, right? In the next decade or so, it will hit China definitely. Yeah, that's something where it will be good to see where this engineering state thesis of his kind of stands on in probably 10 years' time.
Yeah, I think, and somewhere in the book, he does observe, right? Like when you look at China and United States, the nation that perhaps which is going to win is not probably the technology innovation or like who has the highest valuation or any of those things, but who would actually build something that is inclusive of the people and it is in the best interest of the people. That is what he actually underlines and says that it is probably that nation which can really know how to kind of again optimize or maximize for the people's well-being, right, in the long run. That's the nation that's going to kind of well, and that's a great lesson for probably a country like India, right? What are some of the things that even now I think there are several areas probably where India can take some clues from China and adopt and make it better, especially in terms of the execution aspect of it when it comes to the infrastructure or these large scale projects which have to be done well. So those are the areas in which probably it can draw hugely from China, but not to take the social engineering aspect of it, right? Social engineering aspect, I think India has always done fairly well across the nations, whether it is extremely rich and prosperous countries like the US and the other Western countries, or even countries which are underdeveloped. In all aspects, if you compare, India has been maintaining a good social engineering
Yeah.
principle. But for us, what is needed is perhaps in terms of how do you bring innovation and execute at a good scale. And prime examples have already been there for us in terms of how Aadhaar has been implemented, right? And that's, I think, a classic example how you can bring in technology and help for the masses. And today you are empowering a lot of people to kind of have that financial inclusion in the
Yeah.
overall economy participation, right? Today, everybody has a good credit history, at least, that they can go and probably get loans or other things, which was totally lacking because they were never part of any financial system. And today, because all the transactions are digital transactions, so even a small vendor can go and say that, I have a good amount of revenue, right? And can actually look for further funding and all of those aspects. I feel that some of the innovations and engineering that is being applied in last 10, 15 years is in a good way for India. And we need to kind of continue to bring in more of
Yeah.
that. And I think we are already discussing about healthcare and which is much needed for a population of our size. I think
Yeah.
we'll also experience some amount of support that is required for certain aging population. We still need to kind of clearly come out with infrastructure to support that aging population as well.
And plus, just to add to that, right? Like I at least feel in India or some in most democracies, you can see there is always a feedback loop, right? Like when Hari suggested, right? Like it's benefit of the masses, and then if no, then there is some rectification. There is how and kind of the feedback loop that happens. Whereas in China's case, there is like who decides, right? There is only someone on the top kind of decides and gets kind of distributed, right? The socialist, the communist model. Whereas in other countries, it's not that hard fast that okay, one person decides and everything gets implemented, right? So and that's where the even the zero COVID policy, right, or be it the one child policy, which was cruel in the first place and was implemented right across the country. It was introduced in the constitution, if what I read, right? And then after that, even the zero COVID policy, when we know the numbers were not coming out correct of how many deaths were occurring or what was happening inside. So that's some kind of catastrophe, and then the wheels kind of come off in this kind model. So yeah, that's something to be discussed.
Yeah, now those are great observations, and one of the related areas that would have been good to understand is what does the engineering state really mean besides the kind of focus and resources that are directed in that way? Because there's so many nuances of, for example, the U.S. Has a very sophisticated financial sector, venture capital, banking, and others, and there's a lot to be learned. That is kind of that's also a type of infrastructure, right? And the reserve currency status of the dollar. There are many things, there are many aspects of a financial infrastructure that the US has put in place that strongly benefits the country. And some of that is now getting disrupted during this tariff war and others. But that's also something that, will be very important for India as well, because to get the resources to develop, right, in terms of access to financing and other areas, those are crucial enablers of the infrastructure, especially as you were saying, to not to just completely do things purely on debt, right? Which is what China, if you look at the railway system, one of the things pointed out is there's 850, $900 billion worth of debt to build those railways, high-speed rail, which is a very impressive infrastructure, but the profitability from the rail cannot support that amount of debt that was used to build it. So there must be better, more fiscally sound ways of doing that.
I'm also curious to kind of, I mean, since we are all in US, right? Like I'm also curious to kind of see and learn like what can US do? Like, okay, last 50, 60 years, as observation goes, most of the people who are there at the government level and the policymaking level are all coming from the law background. Like, will US ever change? Like, will the composition of that political system ever change? And if it has to change, like, what probably has to be done at the ground level, or like is what I was thinking. Again, I don't have any answers, but like or like probably may have come too far in that space that like we hardly see anybody participating from the any other background other than the probably the law background who are participating in that political system.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good observation in terms of one thing I see that is positive in the United States policy wise is they've seen aspects of what China has done with the engineering states, things like the semiconductor industry or artificial intelligence. You can see that there is now a better top level focus, right, of creating economic policies. Now, it's yet to be seen, can this huge AI build out, for example, will it be successful, given, you see trillions of dollars of CapEx, capital expenditure going into AI. Will that give the returns needed? Will that even be successful in terms of getting the power needed to run the AI? Because one of the things that's often talked about now is that because China invested so heavily in nuclear power and other sources, it has a huge advantage in electric power generation compared to the United States. And with AI data centers consuming so much power, that may be a bottleneck for the US, whereas China has abundant power because of this huge nuclear build out. So even though we talk a lot in the US about the uh, power generation, there's still no nuclear plants being built. China currently has more than 30 nuclear plants under construction. And of course, India has quite a few as well. India, in some ways, is somewhat in between in terms of uh, the growth curve, interestingly. One other thing in the US that is also intriguing is it is a federal system. Some innovation can happen also at the state level. So some states in the US that have better policies will attract the investment and growth. And that's what's seeming to happen. So you talk about the California high-speed rail and other issues of infrastructure development in some states, but then there are other states where you might see much more rapid growth.
For US, I think one of the aspects that it definitely needs to solve is I think the healthcare system and the education, right? Like, and like what can probably US draw from like the engineering aspect of it? Like, how can you actually bring in that engineering mindset perhaps to do something better in these two areas, which is going to be very critical for a country like US, right? Like, because the so-called economic superpower probably does not do very well when it comes to the access to the healthcare and the affordability to healthcare to a larger population, right? So that is an area that definitely can have an intervention with the engineering mindset.
I mean, it has to come out of this whole rut of like, currently it is in, and it can be good, bad, ugly, whatever, but it is somewhere like why are other same developed countries, right, which have say population 4 or 5 times larger than US, but still the healthcare, as Hari mentioned, right, it's top notch. And why can't US be at that level? And there are certain things that they are working on, but it just because of the way the system works, it kind of just fizzles out and it never reaches to the final conclusion. So there are definitely aspects which it needs this mindset, like when you take into the totality of engineering mindset of bringing in key innovations that helps the masses, right, that improves the well-being of the population at large, which happened with, say, the book mentioned the Hoover Dam, or be it the other innovations that happened post World War II, or even prior to that. And yeah, defense is one of the key aspects, but there are other things for day-to-day life. How can US come out of this, where it adheres to this policies of engineer of mindset, where it can purposefully help large masses or help masses? So yeah, there is, and that's the opportunity that's there, right? It's definitely in most cases there is huge opportunity, be it in biotech, in healthcare, in key technology, engineering. And one good aspect, right, what Elon Musk and Tesla with Starlink and with the SpaceX is doing is going beyond boundaries. And so it can happen if there is a will, there is always a way, right? And that's the age-old idiom that we've all grown up to. Like, if there is a will, there is a way. And Elon Musk, in more aspects than one, he's trying to do that. And if the same logic is applied to other aspects, other sectors, definitely there can be huge improvements in those sectors too, which can definitely change the course of this country. So, yeah, opportunities there.
Yeah, those are great observations. And just to link it to something that I thought was one of the practical positives in the book is again this concept that he brings out of process knowledge, right? Which is that until the manufacturing and the full process is present, it's very hard to get this loop, this positive reinforcement loop going. And there's one anecdote in the book that was interesting, where the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, makes an observation that the production, he was asked about, okay, they needed to hire production engineers, and he said, I could fill 10 stadiums in China with that type of engineer, and the US I could probably hardly fill a room, right? And so it may have been a slight exaggeration, but it just shows the sheer scale of the manufacturing and production ecosystem in China and the expertise that has been built, right? Where it's no longer, and that has come because they have the manufacturing and they've cultivated that talent base to serve it. And in the US, it's kind of, we had to almost build it and then start staffing it, because until you have that demand of industry, the education system will not have an incentive to produce. Otherwise, you'll end up with what happened in India years ago, of a brain drain where you're overproducing talent that gets sent overseas. You need to simultaneously also have the domestic demand of manufacturing creators. So there'll be interesting to see how countries like India and the US build that, whether it's make in India or, the US protectionism through tariffs, if that ends up being successful. There are some other success stories, as I was reading a little bit about how this book has been received. Turkey is one country that resembles India in some ways, where it is a democracy with a similar population. It's kind of a higher middle income country, but it has become a very big manufacturing oriented country as well, and very big investment in infrastructure has happened there as well, a bit like China. And so it's an interesting model to understand as well of other countries, how they operate. But their emphasis has been on getting that process knowledge. Turkey benefits from the proximity to Europe. So
Yeah.
it becomes like the manufacturing base for Europe in some ways, right? So just one might say somewhat like how China and Mexico have been for the US. Turkey serves that purpose for Europe to some extent, and that's a lot of manufacturing industry takes place there. And so they have the opportunity to build this process knowledge from having that industrial base. And so it'll be interesting to see how India and others fare in that. One other thing that is not mentioned in the book, but interestingly, there have been a few podcasts that Dan Wang and others have been on, which kind of build, now, especially now that artificial intelligence is top of mind. One of the things that's talked about is that having this manufacturing base will become even more important because the AI, as you know, both of you have expertise. You, Harry in particular, you work in the AI field. Unless you're doing the production at the data generation from that place is where the AI learns from, right? So one of the concepts we talked about is maybe China's edge could even increase because if the manufacturing is taking place there, they are very well equipped to use AI and robotics in their manufacturing, right? They're the ones who can analyze their manufacturing process and innovate quickly. Whereas countries that don't have the manufacturing base, the AI cannot really learn from that yet. And so that's one interesting arguments. It'll be interesting to see where which countries are able to use AI to the biggest benefit, right? And whether will India be in that mix or will it be dominated by the US and by China? That will be really good to watch in the coming years.
And definitely, like it's a wild card, right? India can be a wild card in all of this. Like, for example, it can represent like you have US being, say, in Wang's terms, is more a lawyer state. China being the engineering state, and probably India can be the third front where it's like democracy with genuine engineering ambition and the massive workforce, right? And young workforce. We should, mention this, which is like half of our population or more than half is below 37 years of age. And none of the China's authoritarian toolkit or the baggage that comes for India. This is an experiment. And India, I've always, and this is like, few people have mentioned this, where India is a bumblebee, right? It's where bumblebee cannot fly, but the bee doesn't know, right? So India is, with all the factors it has, right? With the number of religion, with the neighbors that it has, it was bound to fail. But somehow it succeeds, right? In most aspects, and for generations and for civilizations, like it is the oldest civilization that has been constant and it has been progressing. So it is a live and unresolved example, and it's going on and it's building. India is building at scale, be it its marine, be it the infrastructure, the roads, the manufacturing, the MSMEs. So if it wins economically, then it will prove this whole thesis wrong, where it need not be binary, that it not be a lawyer state, it need not be a completely engineering model, but there is this third front where you can build with, which can benefit the masses and with a democracy, basically.
No, very true. And like I completely agree. And like for a country like India, like you can't be skewed in one direction, right? Like in terms of opportunities also, right? Like probably China has emerged to be like more of a manufacturing hub, right? Like and for India, we have always tried to kind of have a mix of manufacturing, services, and other things. I know, like for the last 30, 40 years, probably the services component for the GDP contribution has been higher than the manufacturing aspect itself. But today, like to Arvind's point, like it's also, as we are entering the AI era, it's also very important that like we have the capability and build the capacity to kind of manufacture as well, because you need those machines, you need those robotics to kind of create the data and then feed that to the AI and all those aspects of it. Yeah, I think what country like India needs to do is like uh, as the government has started pushing that like manufacturing in India and make in India kind of stuff, right? So I think you bring in the manufacturing to the same level as the services, right? So the services is required because that's a large talent pool that we have continued to build in the last 20, 30 years. Like even today, most of the people who are going to the educational institutions or the college, like the first thing that they want to kind of go into is like the probably the IT services. Yeah, there's nothing wrong because they are seeing that like it gives them uh, ability to kind of access wealth and improve their life, right? So that will be there, whereas manufacturing is relatively slow, right? Like it's not generally, it doesn't start with a very high paying job at the entry level. So but there is a huge population that needs that as well, right? And so this is where the government needs to kind of think about it and see like how to kind of empower the manufacturing sector, right? And which does have the ability to kind of create large amount of employment and build the standard in manufacturing. What we have not done so very well as being recognized is in the manufacturing sector. Certain aspects we are probably doing well, but in certain other aspects of manufacturing, I think we have fallen behind. So that's the catch-up game that we need to kind of do now. And Tulip, you were saying probably at the larger policy making level, it needs to have that mindset of the US, where you are trying to kind of look for everybody's well-being and you are crafting policies and making sure that impacting the life of the individual in a bad manner. But in terms of the execution, you need the rigor of that engineer to kind of make it happen, because otherwise things will not move. And for that, you need little bit of engineering mindset to bring either innovation or make things happen on the field.
So, any final thoughts or to just capture the lessons?
Yes. What I would say that this has been a great conversation about kind of a thought-provoking book, Dan Wang's Breakneck. I think the book does engage discussions on how nations develop, what policies should be, what mindsets help development. So I think there's some strong positives there. But as we've all said, there are limitations in the framing of the book and the scope of the book in terms of maybe excessive emphasis on the engineering versus lawyerly framing, which is helpful, ultimately limited. And it probably makes sense to study other sources as well. It is interesting to see there may be other books in the future that we could turn to, such as there's a book called Chip War and Apple in China, which touch on similar topics of the U.S. China industrial relationship in some ways, in some very interesting ways. Some of which are similar to this book, but others that are quite different, where um, it's in terms of, for example, Apple in China talks a lot about how, in a way, the US squandered its industrial base and the advantages it had in manufacturing by outsourcing too heavily to China and too aggressively, using Apple as an example of a company that went the extra mile to very extremely aggressively outsource manufacturing to China, and that led to a decline of manufacturing in the United States. So it's a very different angle than this book by Dan Wang takes, because he couches it as an inherent issue in the U.S., whereas the books like Apple and China are more critical in that they actually argue that, in a way, the U.S. squandered the advantage it once had. Of course, this book also talks about the US once being an engineering state, but that balance is interesting. So other books in this topic might be good to cover in the future.
Yeah. And like a couple of final questions that I had, and which is probably for, whoever listens to our podcast and for future references, like, can this, like the engineering state, right? And we talked about China being this, can manufacture, it can scale at breathtaking speed, but can it innovate, right? Because if you've seen over the, even for that matter, even be it the electric cars, be it the vaccines, be it whatever, in the last decade, the core innovation did happen in China, right? It could manufacture, it could do a lot of other things at breathtaking speed. That's scaling up. But the core innovation, like something that has never been done before, something that people have not seen before, can an engineering state deliver that thing? And then the other thing is, what happens when it hits a wall, right? As we mentioned, be it the one child policy, which is going to hamper them in, like, say, in the next decade, be it something like COVID or something bigger, right? What happens when it hits that wall? Can then it engineer itself through those crises is another question that is an open question, and which can be answered or can be seen probably in the next few years.
Tulip, I think to your point, I think for doing innovation needs to be a lot of investment in the research and especially the fundamental sciences. I think one of the recent trends that we have been observing also, like I'm just sharing from the AI perspective, which is there is also movement of several PhDs in mathematics and pure physics who are actually going back to China, right? can using, and there's a reference in this book also, like some many of them people who are graduating in the US universities with PhDs and other things, they are also going back to China. And for any country, like even for that matter in India in general also, you have to kind of innovate. There needs to be a substantial investment and a pool of talent that you have to create who are good in the fundamental sciences, like the physics and mathematics, because the true engineering innovation happens there. And that coupled with like the business participation, right, which is lacking completely in India, right? Like one thing that we have not done anything in India is the industry academia participation to the extent that it has to happen, right? It is suboptimal and probably at many times non-existential, right? So that is something that needs to change. Of the book, while this is a great opener, and I think Dan Wang probably chose because he was observing two economic superpowers and trying to kind of make the comparison. But what would be probably a more comprehensive read also would be probably the Ray Dalio's book that he brought out recently, right? The Principles of the Changing World Order and Why Nations Succeed and Fail. Maybe that offers, I've not read that, but probably it can offer much more broader perspective when you're looking at the individual nation state, and say because your sample size of the nations that you are observing are far more than just China and US, right? So maybe that's a good read for people who are listening to, right? And when they want to kind of really understand what's happening. Thank you. I think it has been a
Thank you.
great conversation here.
Thanks a lot to you, Hari.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.